Hi, everybody. It's me, Beth Maitland with Drama Queen Bee Quilt Studios. And we are moving on to a new vlog post today. And we're going to go downstairs and get to work in the studio. I once recently was at a fabric store and they had really, really cute little jelly rolls and fat quarters and layer cakes, pre-cuts basically, on sale. And I picked up a few and I put them in a drawer. And as is our whole goal for this year, the pandemic and the quarantine, we're scrap busting this year. We're going through our scraps, through our containers and bins, and we're trying to find creative and interesting ways to use up our scraps and be productive with them. We've already talked about in other vlogs making dog beds, making for donations, and otherwise making little tiny projects with our scraps and doing improvisational piecing. We've talked about that a little bit. What we're going to do now is we're going to go down and long arm quilt the job that I just completed digging out one of those old jelly rolls. And I ended up just making a very simple split rail fence pattern. I did it in strip sets of 4. And you'll see the print is so adorable. It's all sewing themed bits and pieces it was a jelly roll. And it was a very easy and quick way, a quick method for me to just go ahead and use up those scraps and get that jelly roll busted and get a little quilt put together. I found some fabric from my stash that seemed to complement the colors. I did a sashing and a border and put it on the quilter. And we're going to talk about some fun things that I did while I was doing the long arm quilting and things that you can do if you are interested in long arm quilting, mid arm quilting, or quilting on your domestic machine. Some practice that you can do to improve your skills before you even put thread and needle to fabric. And so here we go. Let's go down to the studio and take a look. In the meantime, thanks for joining me for my vlog. This is Beth Maitland at Drama Queen Bee Quilt Studio. Okay, take a look at this fabric. It's just so cute. I've got sewing machines and needles and thread and buttons, vintage sewing machines, different colorways, everything in sort of tomato red, burnt sort of golden brown, and some oranges with black and a few little turquoise aqua green accents. And it's just adorable. And it's not a colorway that I'm normally attracted to, but the prints were just too hard to pass by. So I put all these together, and I was mistaken upstairs when I said it was 4 strip sets. Obviously, I used 5 strip sets, and then did sort of some chopping and construction to make a rail fence design. Now, the first thing that you do on a long arm machine when you mount your project is that you have to stabilize it. And sometimes I do basting, but this project is for me. And so for a client, I would maybe do a little bit different practice. But for me, I just want to get down and dirty, get the long arming done, and cut it off and bind it and get this into a quilt that I can use in the studio or for a throw or to keep my knees warm when I'm sewing, whatever. So this is how I would stabilize. And for you folks that haven't really seen a long arm in practice, that turn your quilts over to a long armor, this is a good way for you to see why they ask you for 4 inches all the way around the quilt top of extra fabric in backing and batting. You can see that we need that space on either side to mount your quilt top to the sewing machine, and it needs to be stabilized. There needs to be a little play in the event that the seams that you've created aren't all the way accurate or whatever. We need that space to mount it to the rack as well as to have room to stabilize. So as you can see, I'm stitching in the ditch now. What we did in the middle of the polka dots was I'm doing a design you'll see in a few minutes that requires a spine down the center of that border. So I did that serpentine line and met up with it. As you can see, each time I start a new little area, I stabilize. I sew up and down just a few tacking stitches to make sure that in laundering and in the future, the threads don't come loose and come apart and the stitching doesn't relax. In addition, you'll see that I'm using my ruler not as a stabilizing thing to go along, but actually pushing against my quilting foot to guide my stitches. So I'm actually using the ruler to push along against the stitches. And since I'm here and all my stitch in the ditch is done, I'm just going to pick up where I left off with this sashing design. I'm writing the letter SEW for the word sew. And this is sort of a fast way that I'm showing you of getting the work done within your workspace without having to tie off, because this is what we have to do each time to tie off. I've pulled a little of the upper thread out. Now I'm pulling up the bobbin thread, and I'll be trimming the bobbin and the upper thread. But if I had to do that every time I started and stopped in my short area of space for my workspace, it would take a lot more time. So this is a very time-saving method. And now let me show you that sashing. Oh, the word sew is what I decided to do with this sashing, because obviously it's all about sewing print fabric. So I thought I would just use cursive and use the sewing machine to write sew around the sashing surrounding that whole central area. And it's something that that would surprise most people. All free motion quilting is sort of sketching with a needle and a sewing machine. So on your domestic machine, you move the fabric. Obviously, on a long arm machine, you move the machine. But the theory is the same. It's just drawing with a needle and thread. And so why can't we write? Of course we can. So I thought it was a little fun sashing design rather than do some kind of specialty quilting. I thought I would just write sew, because that's what this quilt is all about. And now you can see we come to the end of my workspace. No problem. I can come back to it, which actually was the clip you watched just before this as we advance the quilt. I just tie off and move on. And when I advance the quilt, I come back to that spot and pick up right where I left off and keep sketching with my sewing machine. Now, I wanted to show you what I also did with that border. You saw that there was this, it's almost like the kind of spine I would use if I were feathering, if I were doing feathers. But what I've decided to do is another easy cursive sketch. This pattern is called L's and E's, and that's literally all it is. And from your perspective, you're seeing it upright now. When we did the sashing and wrote sew, it was upside down to you. But what I'm seeing is it upside down. In long arming, a long armer has to be able to do two designs upside down, right side up, and down each side as well. So when you're practicing in your little scribbling and sketching and drawing on any scrap paper you can find, at work, on a break, watching television, draw, sketch, on anything. It can be the newspaper. It's just about doodling like you used to do in your notebook in high school when you drew peace signs and daisies. It's sort of the same theory. To get really good at long arm quilting, you develop muscle memory, and it starts in the sketchbook or on the scrap pad by just writing and writing. And what have we all been doing our whole lives? Fortunately, when we were young, they taught cursive in school. I don't know if everybody's going to continue that. That's been a big debate about teaching cursive, and because the computers and keyboards have taken over so much, it's almost becoming an antique art. But we've written L's and E's since we could write our names in cursive. And so it's a real easy and clever quilting design that's very fast to do, but still looks lovely and loopy and whimsical and fun. So you can see on either side of this spine, I have mirrored L's and E's. So that is our border design for the entire quilt. And on the topic of repurposing, reusing, using up our scraps, and using up all of our bits and pieces, let's talk about batting. I buy batting for the studio on 15-yard rolls, and it's extra wide, so I can use it for large quilts. But I had little scraps left over that weren't quite big enough. I was shy about 8 inches of being able to complete this quilt. So I took scraps from other projects, and I used a thing called a faggoting stitch on my sewing machine. If you don't have that, or you could use any joining stitch or a zigzag stitch. And I pieced together the pieces of waste batting from other projects, scabbed it onto the bottom, and made up my 8 inches. And I was able to complete the project without having to waste all of that extra batting. I would never do this on a client quilt, but for me, it worked out perfectly. So I just added swirls in the middle, and this is a look at the workspace, how our little sewing quilt is turning out. I just love it. I think it's going to be just perfect, and I busted some scraps. Thank you so much for joining me for a little bit of long arm inspiration and some scrap busting in the studio here at Drama Queen Bee Quilts. This is Beth Maitland. Have a great week. Everybody go out and do something creative. If you have a chance to, get out in the sun and the fresh air for a few minutes. And everybody stay safe, stay well, stay healthy, and stay inspired. All the very best. See you next time.